Okay, so we are recording and you should still see that main title screen. I've got a couple different monitors going here. That's why I keep asking that. Wonderful, and this will go right out in video through email. Whether you're here or not, we'll send it to you, and I'll record all 3 workshops. My name is Kelly Steinke. I'm really excited to be here with you this evening. I would love to hear who's in the audience. So if you wouldn't mind just going into your chats and just giving me, I know your names because I can see them on the screen, but I'm curious what your position is in education, whether you're a teacher, specialist, administrator, psychologist. If you could go into your chat and tell me what your position is, and maybe what your interest is in the science of reading and dyslexia, real briefly, that would be wonderful. All right, so we've got one response so far. We've got a student services director. Thank you, Jerry, for that response. I should have asked what district you're in as well. I know we've got a few people from Green Bay Area School District. I can tell from your email account. Okay, we've got middle school special ed in Chilton. Okay, homeschool mom trying to figure out the best way to help your struggling reader. This is a good place to start here. Anne Marie, your reading specialist, Title I reading interventionist. Let's see here. Deanna, we got Howard's Grove, K through 2 multi-categorical special ed teacher. First grade regular education. Wow, we're kind of all across the board here. So we've got everyone from regular education to retired teachers to student services directors to special educators, and looks like everywhere from Elkhart Lake area to Oshkosh up to Green Bay, Chilton area. Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you for sending that information. I recognize a couple of you, so thank you for attending this chat. Let me just make sure there's no one else waiting here to come in. Okay, we've got one more person joining us. Great, welcome. We were just saying hello. If you could put your position in the chat box, if you wouldn't mind, and the area you are coming from, whether you're a concerned parent, teacher, or administrator, that would be wonderful. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm excited to be here this evening. I get to talk about one of my very favorite topics, which is the science of reading and dyslexia. So it's pretty awesome to be here. I think I get so excited about dyslexia because I've seen the difference an informed teacher, parent, educator, or administrator can make in the lives of a student when they know what dyslexia looks like, how to intervene, how to work with a student who has dyslexia, and how to support that student as well. When you get those 3 things working together, your identification, your intervention or instructional piece, and your support piece, you've got a winning combination. And it's super exciting because when you get those pieces in place, you really do change the entire trajectory of a child's life. I've seen it happen so many times. So if we haven't met before, my name is Kelly Steinke, and I am the founder of a reading center located right in Appleton, Wisconsin. We specialize in working with students who have dyslexia and possibly often other coexisting conditions, a lot of executive functioning deficits and ADD, ADHD. And I have a team of 7 educators. We work one-on-one with students using Orton-Gillingham-based methods and have fantastic results with our students. I am also the author of Silver Moon Spelling Rules, which is a curriculum that is Orton-Gillingham-based. I always say if you can teach a child to spell using explicit and systematic instruction, you're going to also teach them to read. But I'm not here to talk about Silver Moon Spelling Rules. I am also a lecturer at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh in the special ed departments and former president of the Wisconsin IDA branch. Previous to all this, I was a special education teacher, was going to go down the route of admin and leadership. So received my, licensing as a director of special ed pupil services. And at that moment in life, I decided to take a different career path. So I resigned from the schools and opened up a private business and started doing all these different things. So on the screen, you should be able to see two young ladies at the top right. Those are my daughters. And we're going to get into their story in a little bit here. They are both diagnosed with dyslexia. They've been one of my driving forces here in getting into the field. They founded their junior year of high school a nonprofit called Leaders Supporting Readers, which is an organization that fundraises to support families who need testing or intervention services. And the states you see on the right hand of the slide are just simply where I've taught. So I've started in Wisconsin. I'm actually from the Milwaukee area originally and ended up teaching out in Massachusetts for a little bit and Washington State for a longer bit, about 10 years or so, until making it back full circle to Wisconsin, where I currently reside. That's a little bit about me. So why dyslexia? I get this question all the time. How'd you get into dyslexia? No one's really talking about it in the schools. And I ventured into this area, oh gosh, I would say probably 12 to 15 years ago. Well, I'm gonna tell you a little story. So I'll start with this. Picture the first day of school. I was teaching at a school called Prune Hill Elementary, and I was teaching an ELA class. I was a special ed teacher to fifth grade students. They were diagnosed with specific learning disabilities in reading and writing, most of them both. And I've got a picture of my student here on my screen. Okay, not really, right? If you're a Harry Potter fan, hopefully I got some smiles there. You're gonna know this is Ron from Harry Potter. His real name is Rupert Grint, which is kind of a really cool name. He was not one of my students actually, but my student did have really bright red hair and looked kind of similar. So for sake of, not using his actual picture, I chose Ron here. So go back to the first day of school. I'm a new teacher at this school. I taught for about 5 years at this point in time. Okay. And the bell rings, school day is starting, kids start shuffling in, and in comes Ron. Now at this point in time, I knew nothing about Ron. I had never met him before, but he stood out to me. He walked in the door and he's beaming from ear to ear. He's just smiling big. And he makes a beeline straight for me. He extends his hand and he shakes my hand really heartily, really confidently. And he introduces himself. Can you picture this? This is not a common way to start the first day of school. He says, "Hi, Mrs. Steinke." He said my name correctly. Oftentimes I get a different pronunciation, which isn't as pleasurable. He says, "It's nice to meet you. My name is Ron. I've got dyslexia. You're not going to be able to teach me how to read this year. Don't worry, I've got a private tutor who will." Okay, what? It's totally not what I expected to hear from a student on the first day of school. So how does a teacher respond to that? I'm not going to be able to teach him how to read. So, I'm thinking that's what I do. I teach struggling readers to read. But if I'm being completely honest, my students up to that point in time, they never seemed to make a whole lot of progress in reading. And it had been something that really bothered me. They made a little. I just need to make sure. We do have someone waiting to come in, so I'm going to let them in here. Next time I have to set this just so you can automatically join. So as I was saying, I had not seen a whole lot of progress in my students in terms of reading. A little bit here and there, but certainly not leaps and bounds like I had hoped. I had always thought, okay, I'm a special education teacher. My job is to figure out where they're at, figure out what they need, get them up to grade level and get them out, right? With an accommodation plan. That would be pretty ideal, wouldn't it? So I was really curious. Ron had my curiosity for sure. So I decided I needed to figure out exactly what he was talking about. So I called up his mom and I shared with her how he introduced himself. And I realized, it's probably why he had such a big grin on his face when he walked in, because he probably rehearsed the introduction with his mom, right? Because she says, oh yeah, Ron's right. You're not gonna be able to teach him how to read this year. He does have dyslexia. It's on his IEP. And yeah, he's got this private instructor who just has done wonders for him, in terms of progress. So I was actually really excited. I wanted to learn more. I thought maybe this is the missing piece that I didn't even know I was missing, right? Maybe if I contact his tutor, whom I wouldn't even call a tutor, she was a licensed teacher with specialized training in Orton Gillingham methods. Maybe if I contacted her, I could learn from her and figure out how to get my students to make more progress. And that's how my story started, really. I contacted her. She ended up being the president of the Orbida chapter, which is the Oregon branch of the IDA, which is your International Dyslexia Association. And she was just a gold mine of knowledge. So I learned as much as I possibly could. So then there's even, a personal connection here. So if that's not personal enough, right? I'm trying to figure out how I can help my students learn to read, and they're not learning to read like I think they should. Well, the same year I met Ron, my daughters went into kindergarten. And you can see these lovely ladies on the screen here. To the left, that's when they were 5 in kindergarten, and to the right, that's last year when they graduated high school. And, I always thought kindergarten, it should really be fun and games, right? Like, I know the bar is higher nowadays than it was 20 years ago, but kids love kindergarten generally. They learn through play, they have nap time, they make new friends. But this wasn't exactly the case. So let me explain the problem. Here's when my worlds collided. By kindergarten year, neither of them were identifying letters accurately. Okay, they definitely weren't connecting letters to sounds. They still weren't spelling their names correctly. Writing was really pretty much a disaster. They weren't reading high frequency sight words. They weren't rote counting correctly. One of them couldn't figure out their handedness. Am I going to be a righty? Am I going to be a lefty? She kept switching. We had concerns with articulation. They're both getting speech services. Anxiety at school. Hives at 5 years old is not good. And so we had a lot going on. They were really struggling, yet I knew they were bright. Like there was just this complete disconnect for me with what was going on. And I felt like, I was a special ed teacher. I should be able to figure this out. At the time, I didn't know they were dyslexic. I didn't even know we had dyslexia in my family. I simply started learning about it because Ron advocated for himself. So, I became a sponge. I soaked up everything I could. I started reading books, listening to podcasts, taking trainings. I came to a realization that my own daughters were dyslexic. And later that was confirmed by a neuropsych. And that quite possibly many of my students in my special ed classroom were probably also dyslexic, because when I looked at the characteristics, they were lining up. So, it's been almost 15 years now since I started this journey and started learning about dyslexia and the science of reading. The science of reading is a newer term, but it's an exciting topic because you can take kids who have not succeeded previously, who have kind of plateaued out in their reading. And if you have the content that they need to learn and you know how to present it and how to teach it, you're going to change their lives. So ultimately, this is what's brought me here to present in front of you today. Now you should see a nice full screen of my PowerPoint here. I just want to make sure you're seeing the right screen. Are you seeing the PowerPoint just simply without any notes? Okay, great. So I'm going to try to talk for about, goodness, it's already 5:30. I'm going to try to talk for about another 45 minutes or so, and then we'll save the last 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. So our agenda is this. We're going to talk about language development versus reading development. We're basically setting the stage. We're setting a foundation for our next two workshops. We're going to talk about what exactly the science of reading is. We'll take a look at the reading brain and the two routes to reading. We'll look at orthographic mapping research and phases of reading development, and we'll take a look at the three distinct reading profiles and our instructional design continuum. Excuse me. All right, so let's segue into the rest of our presentation here. So why do students struggle with literacy? You know, when I teach classes at the university, typically we'll do a big brainstorming session. So I'll say, you know, why do you think students struggle with literacy? And we'll get the whiteboard up and we'll just start listing reasons kids might have a hard time reading, whether it's comprehension or decoding or something in between. And a lot of these factors come up in our conversation. And then, you know, I've backfilled in the rest, but, you know, this comes right out of the research. So, you know, kids can have cultural differences, of course. So what are the values in the household? What are the needs in the household? Is reading a priority? You know, I worked with a teacher who had a student from an area in Africa about a year ago. And she shared with me that the cultural, you know, distinction of that family was that reading was not really very important. I learned some interesting information about the culture, but, you know, what is the background of the student? You know, maybe there's socioeconomic differences. You know, are there opportunities to access resources? And do they have rich life experiences to build background knowledge? Maybe they're curricularly disabled. Maybe they're not reading because they've had the wrong instruction. Maybe they've been truant. Maybe they don't believe they can read. You know, you get into the Matthew effect. Maybe there's something genetic and neurobiological. Memory can be an issue. You know, if you don't have good enough short-term or working memory, you're going to have a really hard time comprehending. Could there be language-based deficits? You know, can the person decode but not comprehend? Is vocabulary where it should be? You know, what about background knowledge? I'm going through these really fast right now because I'm just setting the stage here for you. We can go on and on. You know, is there traumatic brain injury? Is there an intellectual disability? Are they English language learners? Early speech problems? All of these contributors to trouble with reading boil down to three reading profiles. Okay, as simple as that. A lot of my students are often surprised. There are only three reading profiles under SLD. Either a student has a hard time with word recognition difficulties, so it's difficulty decoding and sounding out words. Or they have a hard time with specific reading comprehension, so comprehending what they're reading. Or they might have trouble with both. So I'm going to pose a question to you. Which one of these reading profiles, I'm going to call this reading profiles throughout our presentation today, do you think is the most common? If anyone wants to offer it up in chat, go right ahead. Now, usually when I ask this question, usually the answer I get is the second one, the reading comprehension difficulties. When in fact, it's the first one. So it's dyslexia or students with word recognition problems. So we're going to call this, we're going to really dive a little deeper into dyslexia in our second part of the workshop next week. But dyslexia accounts for 80% of all reading problems. And if a child has difficulty, or an adult, teenager, whatever their age, with word recognition, meaning they have a hard time sounding out unknown words, this is called dyslexia. And there are various factors, characteristics you can look for when you're looking for dyslexia, and we'll get into those next time we meet. Okay, so let's get into just a little background on language development versus reading development. This is very important to differentiate between how the two develop. So there are 3 ways in which language development is different from reading development. Essentially, the first biggie is that our brains are wired, they're hardwired to learn to talk. You know, when a child is born into a speaking community, all that's needed is for them to be surrounded by their family, their friends, their school classmates, their loved ones, and they're going to start picking up speech, you know, from infant on. It just happens. And this is part of the reason why young children learn second languages so easily. It's because, you know, they have an immense amount of neuroplasticity at that young age, you know, below the second grade level, and they're hardwired to learn language just very naturally, just by being around people that speak that language. All right, contrast that with reading. Our brains are not wired to learn to read. Reading was actually invented by man. Okay, reading wasn't always around. And we won't get into the history of reading, and you know how you start with the hieroglyphics and pictures and move into symbols for letters and all the different alphabet systems. But we're not wired to learn to read. So it was something that we definitely have to be taught explicitly. This means that even when we're surrounded by books and print material, and if we're read to as a child, kids don't automatically learn to read, you know, given that environment and those circumstances. They need explicit instruction to figure out how letters attach to sounds and how they can blend together to create words, and how those, you know, words can be created from syllables. Very fascinating. If you're looking for a good book on this topic, Proust and the Squid by Marianne Wolf writes a really nice book about the difference between language development and reading development. I'm not going to read this whole page to you here, but as you can see on the bottom, from the book I just referenced, she's quoted as saying, "We were never born to read." You know, human beings invented reading over only a few thousand years ago. And with this invention, we rearranged the very organization of our brain. Okay, so which in turn, it's expanded the ways we're able to think, and it's altered the evolution of our species. So it has changed the brain wiring that we have. And that affects children who are learning to read simply by the fact that they need to be taught explicitly. You know, they're not going to just figure out how to read just by being read to and being surrounded by books, which it oftentimes is the assumption, because that's how we acquire language. And in fact, that is how the whole theory and philosophy of whole language came about. You know, the researchers and theorists thought, well, if kids learn how to speak just by being surrounded by speakers, then certainly they can learn how to read just by being surrounded by words and reading and rich literature. And what we've found in the science of reading is that it's just not the case. So in order to learn to read, you know, kids need to learn that those phoneme grapheme correspondences, and your phoneme is your sounds, your graphemes are your letters, and they need to learn how to pronounce them correctly and to pair them with meaning. So we're going to continue setting the stage here for the science of reading. If you look back at the history of reading, reading's been studied extensively for the past 50 years or more. Thousands of studies have been conducted around the world, spanning multiple languages, multiple disciplines. Several of those disciplines are listed here on the screen. And the cool thing is that they've converged with the same set of evidence, the same results and findings. This research, a lot of this was came out with the National Reading Panel, when they produced their big research study many years ago already. And since then, people have tried to disprove what was found during the research of the National Reading Panel, and they found that it can't be disproven. So research has revealed how we can most effectively, assess literacy, teach literacy, and improve student outcomes in literacy. So here are some facts about the science of reading. The reading brain's been studied extensively for over 50 years, but the science of reading, that's a term that's really very new. It really just came out maybe 3-4 years ago. And now it's exploding. It's all over the internet and the social media groups. If you Google science of reading, you're going to come up with tons of references. And some people are confused about what the science of reading actually is. It's a field of study. A lot of people think it's a curriculum. It's not a curriculum. It's a field of study on how our brains acquire written and spoken language. Okay, so it's all the research that has been produced over the past 50 years or more on how the brain learns to read and write and spell. So that's what the science of reading is referring to. And what it's uncovered is that reading is a learned skill, which we spoke about earlier, whereas speaking is hardwired and occurs naturally. Okay, this is why, if you take a struggling reader and, you give the advice of, well, just have them read more. If they read more, they're going to become a better reader. This is not the case. Until a child gets up to a certain point in their reading developments, reading more doesn't beget better reading. What happens is oftentimes they get more frustrated, they get more anxious, and they're guessing. They're using bad habits to try to read words when they have no strategies to read words. So reading more has been disproven. It doesn't create a better reader. You're probably all familiar with the reading rope. It sounds like most of us are all in the education field. So science of reading revealed many things about teaching literacy, including the 5 pillars of reading, right? So, I call these the big 5. We've got our vocabulary, our comprehension, our fluency, our phonics, and our phonemic awareness. And those 5 areas are essential to create a strong reader. And they're all embedded within this rope. If you don't have background on the reading rope, Dr. Hollis Scarborough created this analogy to compare skilled reading to the many strands of a rope. So essentially each strand represents a separate skill. And when you combine those skills with other skills, it creates a skilled reader. And what happens if you have a couple weak strands in a rope? Quite literally, your rope is going to be weakened. It's not going to be as strong as it could be. And so likewise, if you have a couple of these strands on the left-hand side here under language comprehension or word recognition that are weak or deficits, your skilled reading will suffer. So the original rope I read was made of pipe cleaners, and now it seems you can't have a presentation on literacy without including the reading rope in some way, shape, or form. But the goal of this presentation isn't to focus on the 5 components of reading. That would be a completely different presentation. Instead, we're going to focus on what the science of reading has revealed about the brain and reading. So, science of reading and the brain. Science of reading has shown us that there are 2 paths that our brain can use when learning to read. Path 1 is what we would call your neurotypical reading path. So a reader that has no trouble reading at all. It's very direct, it's very efficient. Most people learn to read using this route without any trouble at all. After direct instruction, self-teaching starts to occur. So children take what they've learned in direct instruction and start to apply, to generalize to other words and other patterns. And every word doesn't have to be taught directly to be stored and read. So this is a really efficient path to reading, and this is what we hope students are using to read. But there's a second path, okay? If a person isn't using path 1, then they're reading by using path 2. Excuse me. And this is an indirect route. It's not efficient. It's cause for slower reading, trouble sounding words out, spelling problems, overall difficulty with reading. This is a dyslexic route to reading. I'm going to show you these routes on fMRI images here. So scientists have been able to use fMRI scans to take a look at the brains of people while they're reading. And some of you might be familiar with this research, others of you might not, but this has been replicated time and time again. So it's, very evidence-based and research we can rely on. What they found is that a typical reader, a path 1 reader, has activation patterns that are very different from a path 2 reader, a dyslexic reader. And as you can see in the left-hand image, they're activating neural systems that are mostly in the back of the left side of the brain. Okay, this is the direct route, the big blue circle. And then you've also got the green and the red. But in the right-hand image, you'll notice things look quite different. Dyslexic readers underactivate other reading systems, like the parieto-temporal system, which is your word analysis system, the occipito-temporal, which is your word form system. Notice that's not really even showing up. Because those highways or neural pathways aren't firing when they're learning to read, they're overcompensating with that Broca's area, which is the language center of the brain. It's kind of located right behind the left ear, above and behind the left ear. So because of this brain difference, people with dyslexia, they start to develop alternate neurological pathways to read, right? Because the brain compensates for highways or neural pathways that aren't there. This compensation creates a problem because that section of the brain they're compensating on is the part of the brain, that language processing piece, the orthographic piece that they have a problem with. That is the piece of the brain that deals with the phonology and the phonics and phonemic awareness. And that is the part they're over relying on. So you can see the trouble that they're having. What's super exciting, really exciting, is that the same researchers have been able to provide reading interventions to students with dyslexia different types of reading interventions. And after a period of time, they can do fMRI scans to take a look at whether or not the brain has changed after intervention. And they've found that like an Orton Gillingham based or structured literacy based, so I'm going to use those terms synonymously and we'll really dissect those on day 2, makes the biggest difference. So they've found that the brain starts to normalize. It starts to use the other centers that it's supposed to be using to help the person read. So that's why after intervention, the right type of intervention, you can start to get more fluent reading, more accurate reading, better spelling, just improved overall reading. It's because of the neuroplasticity in the brain. So why is this so important to learn about? Well, it's going to guide how we teach reading, right? It's going to close or greatly lessen the gap for our low performing students if we figure out what to teach and how to teach. You know, our kids are going to have improved grades, better mental health, better, life outcomes. We'll probably see better behaviors. A large amount of kids with EBD issues have reading problems. And when you take a look at the incarceration rates, it's really alarming how many adults who are incarcerated are functionally illiterate. So this is huge. This science of reading stuff is just big, big, big. Intervention studies have shown that 95% of first grade students can be taught to read at a level only constrained by their reasoning and listening comprehension abilities. These are early intervention and early screening is absolutely key. And this came out of Louisa Moat's research. Her book, Speech to Print, is an excellent resource as well that was just published in 2020. So this term, orthographic mapping. Linnea Airy is probably the most influential and most cited reading scientist in the past 40 years. She was one of the original 14 members of the National Reading Panel, and she sat on, I believe it was the phonics and phonemic awareness part of that panel. This is her definition of orthographic mapping. OM involves the formation of letter-sound connections to bond spellings, pronunciations, and meanings. Okay, so those 3 things, spellings, pronunciations, meanings, of specific words in memory. This is the process the brain uses to explain how children learn to read words by sight, spell words by memory, and acquire vocab words from print. So orthographic mapping is the goal of all reading, of developing a skilled reader. It's how the brain learns to read accurately and fluently. A simpler definition of orthographic mapping was put out by David Kilpatrick. He's a well-known reading researcher as well. He published the Equipped for Reading Success book, which is all about phonemic awareness. And he's quoted as stating, orthographic mapping is the mental process we use to permanently store words for immediate, effortless retrieval. So I got a little map in the corner because I like to think of orthographic mapping as a map, really, the map in your brain. So the part of your brain that combines the sounds with the letters, with the meaning, with automatic retrieval of the word. That's reading. It's not possible to memorize every single word that needs to be read. And so this is the process that needs to take place. The average vocabulary for an adult, if you just search this up, you're going to get ranges between 25,000 and 40,000 words, in our vocabulary that can be read. And, it's just not possible to think that a child, even in the elementary level, could memorize all the words that they need to read. And this is why so many kids are referred for special education for reading disabilities right in and around the third grade year. And that's a really common year for kids to be referred. It's because vocabulary completely explodes during that year. The vocabulary just gets so much larger than K and 1 and 2. Where in K through 2, our bright kids, they can compensate. If they don't know how to sound words out, for the most part, they're usually able to guess by context, guess by picture clue, guess by maybe the shape of the word, all those compensation strategies. And when they hit the third grade, boom, none of those are reliable anymore if they can't sound a word out. Okay, so orthographic mapping, just to give you a visual. I like visuals. Our students like visuals too. It really is essentially going from your phoneme, so your sound. So for instance, we say ch, those diagonal lines are your sound bars, to your spelling. So ch, if you hear that at the end of the word, it's always generally spelled T-U-R-E. Okay. To identifying that automatically and using it in reading and spelling. And all of these pieces are kind of under the umbrella of meaning, what the word part or the word means. So your orthographic mapping is when your brain makes a connection between your sounds and your letter sequences and can effortlessly, retrieve that sound in order to read and apply meaning to it. There are 4 necessary components for this orthographic mapping to occur. And they're seemingly pretty simple. I mean, it gets a little more complex when we'll talk about in workshop day 2, the ins and outs of dyslexia. And especially in the 3rd day, we'll get into what needs to be taught and how it needs to be taught. But, first, kids need to know their letter recognition, their shapes, their names, their uppers versus lowers. No matter their age. I get even students in 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th grade that don't have some of these skills down. And then they need their phonics skills, their knowledge of letter sound relationships, including all the vowels. So what sound connects to what phonetic patterns. Phonemic awareness skills are essential as well. So they need to be able to blend, separate phonemes, separate sounds into words and segments. So breaking sounds apart, breaking words apart, and even breaking multisyllabic words into syllables. If you get an older student, even a younger student, but say you have a 7th grader and they can't hear the syllable breaks in words, try this once. Give them the word animal, hospital, triangle, whatever it might be. If they can't go mo, give them 10 to 20 words and just see how they do. There's a phonemic awareness issue there. Oftentimes, when my students come in and they're struggling with decoding, they're dyslexic, I'll ask them to clap out the syllables in some of these multisyllabic words, and I'll get something like this. And mo, no matter their age, they don't hear the breaks. It's just like one big amorphous blur, and they're trying to guess at where those breaks are. And then fourthly, repeated practice, explicit and repeated practice for reading skills and spelling skills, because the reading and the spelling reinforce one another. If you're teaching decoding and completely forgetting about the encoding part of it, you're missing a lot of bang for your time and energy. If you compare in your spelling skills with your reading skills, you're going to be reinforcing both ends of the language. So these 4 components come right out of Linnea Airey's research. These are her 4 phases of reading development. You're going to find the 4 components here. It gets a little more complex when you start fleshing this out. But you basically have your pre-alphabetic phase, your partial alphabetic phase, your full alphabetic, and then your consolidated, which is your goal, which is your skilled fluent reader. This is definitely an introductory course. We're going to move through this content a little quicker. Maybe in the future, I'll have a course that's a little more in depth on some of these topics. But if you have questions, afterwards, just jot them down right now and we'll talk it through afterwards. I'll try to answer them as best I can, or point you in the direction where we could maybe find the answer together. This is a simple view of reading. Your algebraic formula at the bottom of the screen your RC stands for reading comprehension. And, the ultimate goal of reading is, of course, to get meaning from what you're reading. It's to comprehend what you're reading. And what they've found is that reading comprehension is it's equal to your language comprehension times your decoding. The reading comprehension is a product of language comprehension and decoding. So to further define the different types of reading disorders, remember we've got 3 profiles. What are they? Okay, remember we've got our decoding, our comprehension, and our mixed reading profile where they struggle with both. So to further define that, we can use this grid. I'm going to get out my pen tool here, and we'll take a look at this a little bit. So the first question at hand is, what kind of student am I working with? What is the reading issue? And I caution you, when you're looking at that, because as a special ed teacher, former special ed teacher, I had a lot of kids that came with IEPs, if they were new students under the SLD category of comprehension. This happened all the time. And when I got to working with them and getting to know their skills and screening them, what I found is that most often my younger students didn't really have comprehension problems. They simply couldn't read the words on the page in order, well enough in order to comprehend. Now, dyslexia does not include, it really doesn't encompass comprehension problems unless it's let go long enough and it snowballs into a problem with comprehension. So let's check this out. Your dyslexic profile is going to be someone with good listening comprehension. So our left-hand side here is listening comprehension. It can be good or poor. Let's say you have a student in 5th grade. He's a good comprehender, but gosh, really struggles to sound words out. Okay, that's a dyslexic profile. We can switch that scenario. Let me clear off my drawing. Let's say your reader has poor listening comprehension. Okay, they don't understand the story, the summary, they can't infer meaning after they've listened to something. But they also have poor word recognition. You've checked and verified, that's what the issue is. If you follow this across, this is someone with a mixed reading disorder. So they're going to be dyslexic and have comprehension issues. Furthermore, let's say you have a person, a student who has poor listening comprehension, but really good decoding. Here we go. We've got our specific comp deficit. And the most often type of disability I see this with is students who have autism. Oftentimes students with autism are hyperlexic. They can read, decode beautifully, usually well above their years, well above their grade level, but then they haven't understood what they're reading. Not all cases, but in many cases. Now, if you have a good comprehender and a good reader, of course, then there is no issue at all. That's non-specified. So I always coach teachers and my students to really check and verify, what is the issue we're dealing with? What kind of profile does your student fit? Decoding, comprehension, or mixed? Plot it out on our simple view of reading chart here. And then let's take a look at our continuum of approaches to teaching reading. I don't like to blanket one specific reading intervention or methodology as inherently bad, unless it's whole word, right? Let's be honest. Whole word is not good for anyone to learn how to read. So we're going to cross that out right here. But these other systems of teaching reading, so we've got our structured literacy, AKA Orton-Gillingham. We've got our linguistic system, which is like your SRA, your direct instruction programs. Usually these types of programs are found in a special education classroom. And then we've got our whole word with embedded phonics. So this is going to be more the most common is Fontes and Pinnell, right? So F&P, balanced literacy, or guided reading. Also found in lots of special education classrooms. So what we're going to do here, this is a plot from, as you can see, most explicit instruction to most implicit instruction. And of course, implicit comes from the word to imply. And if you imply something means the learning is assumed. You're assuming a child will catch on to the learning. So the most implicit type of instruction is, of course, your whole word, and then your whole word with embedded phonics. And as you get further to the left, you get into the very explicit types of instruction, which are your structured literacy, and a step under that would be your linguistics. Now, if you follow this left-hand side, sorry, this is a crooked arrow. This, towards the bottom, if we follow it across with my orange arrow, we're going to see that those curriculums and interventions that are more implicit are more comprehension and literature driven. So the focus is comprehension and understanding and vocabulary and background knowledge, all that type of stuff. Let me clear off my drawing so I don't start to confuse myself here. And let me close that out. So if we want an intervention to work with a student who has a profile of comprehension needs, we're going to follow this continuum across. Okay, so I'm in the comprehension category. I'm going to go across, and it can be, that's going to be a little more implicit usually. So we're going to look at something like a balanced literacy type of a program. Okay, that's probably going to do great for a student who has comprehension needs. But our dyslexic readers, our readers that are having a hard time just decoding the words on the page, they need something extremely explicit, something that's very decoding driven. Okay, so if you're teaching in a special education classroom, the best of the best, the cream of the crop, the most bang for your time and energy, your students are going to make the most gains. Science of reading has shown us if you can employ a structured literacy or Orton-Gillingham based intervention. If a child has mixed reading needs, you can incorporate comprehension into this type of system. So I would definitely fall on this methodology. If a student has trouble with comprehension, you can add comprehension into that. If you're working with students who are just hovering below grade level, there's not a big gap. They just need a little fine tuning, nothing major. Okay, then your linguistic programs might do the job just fine. And, that might include like reading recovery, your SRA reading mastery type series. But if you are really working with a student who has some major gaps in their reading ability or their spelling ability in terms of decoding and fluency and accuracy, you want to get something that's as explicit and decoding driven as possible. Hopefully this makes sense. I'm going pretty fast through this stuff. So we're going to wrap things up in probably the next 5-10 minutes, and then we'll have 5-10 minutes for questions if you have any questions. But let's take a look at what we know from what we've discussed today. So we know that dyslexia represents 80 to 90% of all learning disabilities. I don't think I shared that with you today, but it's coming in workshop part 2. So here's a preview. 80 to 90% of all LDs are attributed to dyslexia. That is huge. We also know that it's the most common reason a student will struggle to read. Okay, so dyslexia affects 15 to 20% of the general population. We're not talking special ed, we're talking just general population. We also know that the science of reading has shown us how the brain learns to read and spell and what needs to happen to make orthographic mapping occur, that quick automatic word reading, and to that extent, that shared teaching theory where students start to recognize patterns and begin to teach themselves new words because they've generalized patterns into words that they are learning. And lastly, we also know that the majority of our Wisconsin public schools, they're not trained to screen for dyslexia. They're not trained to identify dyslexia or teach students with dyslexia. Now, what's exciting is that our first piece of legislation in Wisconsin was passed in 2019. And this legislation is a dyslexia guidebook for teachers and parents. It was mandated that all school districts in Wisconsin put this guidebook on their district website for teachers and parents to access. So if you're working in a school district, try to find the guidebook, share it out with people. It's got a lot of great information on dyslexia, because we need to start talking about it more and identifying it and knowing how to work with students so we can help this reading crisis that we're in. Because we have a real crisis on our hands. If students with word recognition difficulties account for for 80% of all reading problems, then think about this. Wouldn't the lens through which we teach, what we teach and how we teach have to match that? So 80% of our methodology, wouldn't that have to be catered to people with reading, decoding issues like dyslexia? And if this doesn't happen, then we have students that they just never learn to read beyond a certain level. That's why you get the third grade wall. Kids, they always hit the wall in and around the third grade. By the end of third grade, sometimes they're let go much longer. I'm very used to getting students in my clinic that are 4, 5, 6, and 7 years behind in grade level. And it's just heartbreaking because, they really do suffer with a lot of secondary conditions. Anxiety is huge, depression is huge, avoidance is huge, behaviors are huge. And you know what? The majority of these kids, they can be brought up to grade level, even with that massive gap, in usually 2 to 3 years of a really intense intervention. But as educators in the schools, we want to catch this when they're young. We want to get on top of it quick, so that they don't end up with this massive gap in their skills and suffer with secondary problems. So what is the problem at hand? We have lots of research. Science of reading has shown us lots of research, but we don't have a lot of dissemination of that research, and we're lacking training, teacher training, district training, so forth. We have excellent teachers in Wisconsin, good people who are smart and care about our students. A lot of times, though, they need strategies that support orthographic mapping, the sounding out of words for eventual automatic reading. There's your lack of training. We have reading interventions that are used, but they're being used without aligning them to the student's reading profile. I can't tell you how many times I talk with a special ed teacher and they say, they have one reading intervention for all of their students who have reading disabilities, and that's just what they use. And if it's a balanced literacy system like Fonts and Pinnell, that's not going to teach a kid how to decode. They're going to reach a certain point and they're just going to plateau. And there is research to support that. If some of you need the research behind that, I can guide you to that. And furthermore, we have dyslexia in our classrooms. All of us do. There's probably not a family in America who's not touched by dyslexia in some way, whether through family or friends or colleagues, because it's affecting 15 to 20% of our general population. But we're not screening for it by and large, and we're not supporting it. So herein lies the problem. So how do we fix it? And this is just, there's a lot that goes into this, but essentially we need to know what to look for, right? We need to know how to teach and intervene using structured, explicit, and simultaneously multisensory approaches. And we need to know how to support kids with dyslexia. I always refer to this as kind of a three-legged stool kind of analogy. So, when I talk to parents or teachers, I always say, you're going to have a really wobbly stool. It's not going to have a firm foundation if you have one of the legs missing, or two of the legs missing. So first, know what to look for. Diagnose, assess, screen. It's not realistic that all our kids will have neuropsych evals. It's just not going to happen. But if we educate ourselves and know what to look for from a systems perspective, and then secondly, if we have interventions and training and know how to use that, structured, explicit approaches, and then thirdly, know how to support kids in terms of technology or accommodations. When you got those three working together, you got a winning combination for our students. And I'm just about to wrap things up here for the day. So the late, great Margaret Bird Rawson, amazing woman. This is just a really great quote. She's quoted as saying, dyslexic students need a different approach to learning language, from that employed in most classrooms. They need to be taught slowly and thoroughly the basic elements of their language, the sounds and letters that represent them, and how to put them together, blending, and take them apart, segmenting. That was the research from Airy. They have to have their writing hands, eyes, ears, and voices working together in conscious organization and retention of their learning. And we're going to talk about, simultaneously multisensory strategies next workshop. We'll talk about the language triangle and how to get those neurons firing together so they can wire together so you get more efficient learning. And that is the end of today's workshop. I hope this has been informative for you. I'm happy to take questions at this point in time. I believe we have about 10 minutes. So you can just turn on your microphone or you can send them through chat. And if you want to email me privately, you can email me privately. I always say, check and verify, what you're hearing. If you're like, that doesn't sound right, check and verify or ask. If you need the research behind anything I've shown you, I'm happy to dig that up and send it to you. Well, this has been a pleasure. If no one has any questions, we can sign off. Amanda, did you have a question?
I do. I'm a little different because I just have one student. But I'm just wondering how important it is to get an actual diagnosis, or I mean, is it? I'm pretty sure he has it. So is it best to just jump into these methods and go from there? I don't know.
Well, that's a diagnosis question is always a good question. And it really, I would say it depends on your goals. You know, if we're talking about a student who is in 10th grade, has no special ed supports, needs lots of accommodations to keep up, like books, you know, audible books and voice typing, then diagnosis is extremely important, right? To try to get that paper trail going.
Okay.
But if you're talking about a younger student, it's not always necessary. If you got your team at school working, you know, in the child's best interest, a lot of times families pursue diagnosis just to help them get the help that they need at school.
Okay.
But if you're in a school district, like I've done some work in the Portage area school district, and they are actually screening students for dyslexia. They're writing individual dyslexia support plans, and they're training, you know, they're specialists and teachers on how to work with students who have dyslexia. You know, if you're in that ideal situation, it might not be necessary. So I think everyone's situation is a little bit different.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's see, I think I've got something in my chat here. Anne Marie, you're asking, I've taught myself what I know about Orton Gillingham. How do you get trained in Orton Gillingham? There's a lot of different avenues you can take, you know, a ton actually. If you want to message me privately through email, it's real quick, you can go extreme. I mean, you can become an Orton Gillingham practitioner and do the whole practicum and everything through the original Orton Gillingham on the East Coast. That would be where you're writing all your own lesson plans and really individualizing. Or you can go through an organization like Institute for Multisensory Ed. They're a training program that certifies people kind of in their system, and they're Orton Gillingham influenced. You can also go through some of our universities in Wisconsin are starting to do micro-credential programs that certify dyslexia therapists. Carroll University, I taught in their program for a little while and supervised there. They have a micro-credential program that teaches teachers basically how to use Orton Gillingham and write their own lesson plans. I think Whitewater has another program, a micro-credential program, and there's a couple other colleges in Wisconsin that do as well. So there's the different paths you can take. Go through micro-credential, you could go through the academy on the East Coast, you could go through a specific program that certifies. Or, you know what I recommend, advocate in your school district that they bring in some training, you know, so you can get the whole team trained. Kelly, if you want a private, let's talk about that through email. Her question is in regard to 504 plans. It's a real specific question about a student. Kelly, did you want to ask something specifically about what you chatted to me on?
You don't mind, I have a little one here. I know I teach in the Ripon School District and live in Oshkosh, but I know looking to get my son assessed, some of the pediatricians won't accept even, you have to have a referral if you're already attending that medical field or company, I guess. So we went and just had a screening done, and then they were able to say he had, you know, all of the qualities or tendencies of dyslexia, and that was enough to go through our school psychologist to get modifications for testing and just in the classroom to give him additional support. So I mean, that's another route to go for parents if they need it.
Yeah, that's I'm glad you mentioned that too, because you can also find a screener and just screen for dyslexia instead of doing the full-blown psychological eval. Thank you for sharing that, Kelly. Anyone else? We did good on time tonight. We got 3 minutes left, and this is like perfect timing. Okay, I'm excited for next week because we'll dive deeper into what dyslexia is, what it looks like. And that's really going to be our primary focus next week. Like, how can you start to tease this out and look for it within your students? And then the third workshop will really dig into, all right, well, let's say we've identified it. We think we've identified it. What kind of strategies and supports can we use? You know, what's going to work? So that's where we're going next. So everyone have a great night. I'm going to sign off here, and feel free to email me if you think of something, you know, in the future, and otherwise we'll see you next week, Wednesday. Okay, take care.